Alright everyone, welcome back to the Expedition Guide. So we are going to tackle part 4 now, the Kharakid Social Systems, Kiith histories and societal roles. This is basically more or less along the lines of what the previous historical briefings have done there, and it's basically the same, almost word for word, but there are some slight differences in some of them, and there are some new Kiith, I believe, in here anyway. But let's go through it all as usual. Kharakid Social Systems. Society on Kharak is organized along loose family associations, many of which now include hundreds of thousands of members. An extended family grouping is called a Kiith, or Kiithid, and most archaeologists agree it is a social artifact that dates back before the beginnings of recorded history. A Kiith has a loose hierarchy based on one's social position within the family. Originally, this was based primarily on seniority, but as technology has changed the face of life on Kharak, the Kiithid too have changed, and now family ranking is based more on wealth or personal influence than age. Organization within the Kiith is recursive in nature and models that of a core family unit, where a single family has a primary leader, a secondary, and then a group of dependents. The next level of Kiith organization is based on the same system. There is a primary family who makes policy decisions, a secondary family which hears disputes and makes recommendations, and a number of families of lesser power that have sworn allegiance to the primary. The primary family within a Kiith is called the Kiith Sa. This structure is not static by any means, and while it is not a trivial matter, families are free to change their primary allegiances as they see fit. A family's position within the Kiith rises and falls with how many swear allegiance to them. Although it is much rarer from time to time, a family will move from one Kiith to another or even feel the need to become their own full Kiith. In ancient times, a Kiith Sa could direct all within the Kiith to war, demand families dedicate time and finances to special projects, or even move the Kiith to another region. In modern times, the Kiith Sa is a political and financial leader only in that it acts on the wishes of the entire Kiith as established by referendums. The Kiith Sa from all over Kharak meet in the Great Diamid, located in the capital of Tyr, to debate global policy and resolve legal conflicts between Kiithid. Traditionally, Kiithid concentrate their power on one or two disciplines and gather families under their banner by being the best place to find advancement in a particular field. For example, Kiith Sajet has been associated with the sciences on Kharak for over 1,000 years and is known to have the most advanced computer labs in the world. Bonded couples interested in the field often apply to a Sajet family associated with such labs. Alliances between Kiithid are also based on mutual interests, and they often lead to closer ties or complete reorganizations. In the modern era, the Kiithid have slowly transferred their power to the individual, but it should be noted that it is still a powerful means of social identity. Kharakid society pursues a single goal today, and our new sense of racial destiny has reminded us that we are all families of one grand Kiith. Unfortunately, for the unity of our people, tradition dies hard, and it takes little stress for any Kharaki to think of family first and Kharak second. So there was that. Now we're going to go and read the individual Kiith histories, right? All the way from Sajet down to Kanef. Some of these are fairly long, and many of them are basically the exact same as in the original technical and historical briefing, but like I said, just for the sake of completionism, we're going to go through them. So let's start with Sajet. Kiith Sajet is something of an oddity among the power structures of the Kiithid. While they are an ancient and respected Kiith whose expertise has been courted by Kiithid Sa across Kharak, they have never parlayed this influence into any real political power. The true power of Kiith Sajet lays in its underlying desire to question, observe, predict, and record. In ancient times, they were the first to plot the path of the planets in the Kharakid system and derive a calendar from them. They were the first to discover the 13-year progressive cycle of sandstorms that tear around the equator of this world and predict where the rains that follow the end of every cycle would fall. Most of the impartial histories of the heresy wars and the resulting reformation were penned by Sajet scribes, who recorded it along with their observations of topsoil destruction and the slow crawl of the sands northward. During periods of upheaval, Kiith Sajet have always been too valuable as allies and advisors to be turned into vassals. Any Kiith who killed or attempted to interrogate a Sajet was shunned by the science philosophers for a period no shorter than 100 years, and in order to keep their knowledge from being corrupted, any Kiith who wished to become Sajet swore an oath directly to the Sajet Sa, and had to serve faithfully for 2 generations before being instructed in these sacred wisdoms. The closest thing to a scandal that has ever shaken the Sajet Kiith occurred during the Time of Reason, when it came to light that during the Heresy Wars, certain Sajet vassals had actually lived under a secret secondary oath to Kiith Nabal. These secret Nabal used their positions of Sajet immunity to move through the various warring factions and carry out missions of retrieval and intelligence gathering. When this truth was revealed, the sense of outrage was strong, but Fleer Sajet Sa realized the extremity of the situation may have justified the betrayal. Even though she was able to bring enough of her Kiith over to this line of reasoning to avoid sanctions or exile for the families involved, there is still a lingering thread of mistrust between some Sajet and Kiith Nabal to this very day, and the debate over the use of science as power is still a passionate one. As the Time of Reason progressed, Kiith Sajet expanded their studies and moved away from the tradition of celestial mechanics and mathematics. Various families began to delve into the nature and origin of life on Kharak. Within a century, Krill Sajet presented a paper to the Diamid in Tyr, presenting the scientific evidence that we bore little biological similarity to the vast majority of Kharakid life. This scientific proof of the religious tenet of exile shook Kharakid society, but established once and for all that Kiith Sajet served the truth, however disturbing that might be. Gulsian. Of all the Kiithid, none has lost more throughout the centuries than Kiith Gulsian. The Gulsian line is ancient, and some of the oldest documents on Kharak bear their sigil. By the time recorded history begins on Kharak, the Gulsiani were already a spiritual and political force to be reckoned with. While minor cults have come and gone, the majority of Kharaki have always believed in the great maker Sejuk, whose hand shapes what is. The majority of religious sects differ not over whether Sejuk exists, but in what his nature may be, and his reasons for bringing us to Kharak. The majority view until the Time of Reason was some variation of the theme of punishment, the logic being that no just god would leave his people on such an inhospitable world if they had not done something to earn this fate. Many vital survival tactics, such as conservation of resources and not risking the future of the Kiith on untried methods, were reinforced by dogma in ancient Kharak. Undesirable acts were always described in terms of punishable arrogance. Those beliefs helped keep our people alive during the Great Trek from the Central Deserts, but once in the temperate polar regions, the same beliefs held back useful innovations that the more hospitable environment made possible. Generally, how wrathful one believed Sejuk to be tended to dictate how wary one was of cultural and technological advances. Of the 3 major religious Kiithid, Gulsian, Feral, and Somta, it was Gulsian that preached the strongest message of punishment. The dogma of righteous suffering and humility that Sejuk had cast our people down to Kharak from some celestial paradise to pay for our arrogance. Gulsian theologists preached that to deviate from the most accepted and ritualized survival methods was to actually extend the period of time before our people would be lifted back up to heaven. In the early days, this strict dogma paid off and allowed Kiith Gulsian to survive and prosper during various ecological disasters during the period between 75 to 250 KDS. Once this turbulent time passed and people penetrated further into the temperate polar region, more innovative Kiithid regained their power and Gulsian power began to fade somewhat. Many archaeologists believe that Kiith Gulsian deliberately started the Heresy Wars as an attempt to bring all the lesser Kiithid back under its power during the resulting chaos. Fortunately for the technically inclined among us, it was Kiith Nabal which emerged victorious from the Heresy Wars, and the dogma of penance and repression began to fade from the hearts and minds of Kharaki. Despite this, the Gulsian, their power shattered forever after nearly 300 years of war, became even more extreme in their religious beliefs, as if to compensate for the rest of the sinful planet. By the time the Time of Reason was at its height in 710 KDS, the Gulsian were down to less than 30 vassal families, and only the great desert temple city of Saju Ka remained under its power. Perhaps it was the sense that history had passed them by, or simply a desire to commit an act of sacrifice strong enough to regain the favor of Sejuk himself. But in the year 717 KDS, the Kiith Sa of the Gulsian performed an act that has lived in infamy ever since. At the time, Sajuk Ka was the artistic gem of Kharak. In its great temples and halls were the most great works commissioned in the name of the god Sajuk, and in its libraries were the collected works of our people, gathered before his eyes so that he could see them and judge us worthy. Though Sajuk Ka had been built in the first hospitable valley found in the north, time had allowed the deserts to crawl ever northward themselves. By the 700s, sand would have completely swallowed Sajuk Ka if not for the complex series of wind baffles, dikes, and sand paths designed by the great engineer Garnabal. One night during the height of the spring winds, Sajuk Ka was lost to our people. In a single act of divine madness, Mirpat Galcian Sa ordered his people to blow up the entire system that held back the sand. The light from the hundreds of explosions was still visible when the hungry sands began pouring down the streets of Sajuk Ka. Within 2 days, the city was completely buried and thousands died in the mass evacuation. The whole of Kiith Galcian was convicted in absentia by the Diamid in Tyr and deemed an outlaw Kiith, but this punishment had very little effect on the Galcian as they slipped away into the wastes during that terrible night, abandoning the progress they saw as decadence that would eventually bring down the wrath of God. Since then, Kiith Galcian has wandered the great central deserts, surviving by the skills and rituals they hold so dear. Occasionally, they make themselves known by raiding scientific communities or stations in the wastes and leaving massive theological documents proclaiming how close we are to the end. Military expeditions to track them down once and for all have always failed, and a certain mythology has grown up around them, as if there is a nagging suspicion in the minds of modern Kharaki that the only way Kiith Galcian could have survived is if they really did have the grace of Sajuk. Some say that they have even found his lost city under the sands, and Sajuk Ka once again echoes with mumbled prayers and offerings made in the darkness. Even now, it is likely that there are still families secretly aligned with the ancient religious Kiith. Threat Analysis, Diamond Security Council Briefing, AX-4, Closed Door Session. Presenting Officer, Consol Nepaktu, Diamond Intelligence Arm. As concluded in Briefing AX-3, it is clear that Kiith Galcian is now an immediate prime-class threat to any coalition holdings outside the polar zones, as well as the remaining forward bases, no matter how heavily reinforced. Kiith Samta has reported the loss of 3 ore convoys in the first triad of this year alone, and armed sorties against the wall fortresses get more daring with each passing month. More disturbing is that against all simulations, Galcian combat units keep getting more advanced and numerous. All of the strategic simulations have clearly indicated the opposite should be happening, as Galcian expulsion-era habitats and production centers begin to fail from attrition. Even factoring in illicit trading with sympathizer families, the Galcian should be incapable of mounting military operations, and yet they do. This briefing will cover the following 3 issues and review the most possible answers. 1. How can the Galcian maintain operations? 2. How can the Galcian be researching new technologies? 3. Where are the Galcian production and population centers? In short, they can't. Our given current understanding of the situation, there must be at least one hidden factor at work here. The Galcian are clearly receiving enough resources to maintain a war footing and support their population. The most obvious answer is that one of the major Kiithid in the Diamond Table is a secret ally. Fortunately for the unity of our alliance, there is not enough evidence of redirected resources or large amounts of signal traffic unaccounted for to implicate any of you. In case any of you doubt my renunciation of all loyalties to my birth Kiith, I will point out here that Paktu had unusually high encrypted traffic, along with both Nabal and Sidim, but none were high enough to maintain the coordination of a supply operation large enough to sustain the Galcian. From this, we can only conclude, barring that the Galcian actually receives gifts directly from God, that they have found a new rich source of supply somewhere deep in the southern hemisphere beyond the range of our tight beam sensor arrays. If this is true, and it seems the most likely answer, then the Galcian must be separated from this newfound source of resources as quickly as possible. 2. Evidence that they are committed to research and development comes in the form of entirely new designs for Galcian vehicles sighted in recent years. Analysis of wreckage from their raids clearly indicates that the Galcian military branch has been making leaps in metallurgy and energy systems that seem beyond even our wise friends from Kiith Sajet. Once again, we can eliminate internal betrayal as a cause. I doubt that if any of you were making breakthroughs at this level, you would be trading it away to desert raiders instead of using it yourself and profiting directly. Nonetheless, it is a worrisome problem that when anti-technology religious fanatics start making leaps in tech, it means their innovations are probably not coming from their own schools and labs. The Gaussian must be coming across tech that is functional in and of itself, and it is not being delivered to them by one of us. Then they must be finding it somewhere out in the wastes. 3. Gearing up for full warfare requires a concentrated population base and industrial centers. We have not found a trace of either over the past 10 years of increased activity. While Kharak is not an easy world to search, with the recent advent of scanning sats, we have a fair portion of the world under surveillance. We see a bit more than we have commonly made known to the general diamond. Unfortunately, this has not been helpful in tracking down Gaussian holdings or transporters, which leads us to believe that they have to be concentrated in the deep south, where the constant storms make a mess of both our optical and signal intelligence sensors. From your growing murmuring and whispers, ministers, I can tell you have come to the same unpleasant conclusion that intelligence has. The odds are very good that Kiith Gaussian has come across a source of resources and technology somewhere in the Great Desert. It's possible that they have even found something in connection to the Jiraki anomaly itself. If this is so, then it is imperative we launch Operation Kadim as soon as possible. While the failure of Operation Skalbri and the large loss of life associated with that failure will always be a stark reminder of the price for rushing preparations, we nonetheless cannot assume we are safe here behind our walls, forts, and sensor towers. At our current projections, it is only a matter of time before Gaussian forces hit us with something we cannot withstand. In conclusion, Intel strongly advises that Operation Kadim receive full attention and the carrier Kabisi be launched fully equipped for war. Nabal. Not much is known about Kiith Nabal prior to their dramatic emergence at the end of the Heresy Wars. There are a few scattered mentions of them in the records of the major Kiithid in the First Epoch, but the name Nabal arises only in terms of tradesmen or heretics. Kiith Gaussian were particularly vehement in their persecution of families under the Nabal flag, and there is some evidence that it was Gaussian persecution that drove Nabal to their hidden valley refuge, blasted into the edge of Kharak's tiny northern ice cap. But these loose facts are all that we have when it comes to understanding the origins of this powerful Kiith. Kiith Nabal itself seems uninterested in clearing up the distant past, and the hard facts only begin to appear in the years directly before the Nabal intervention, when the Kiith moved to end the Heresy Wars and establish the Diamond. In those 3 centuries of chaos, Kiith Nabal was had almost completely cut off contact with the rest of Kharak. Traders or refugees who accidentally stumbled into the valley were welcomed with open arms and given a place to make their lives anew. There is no record of any rejecting this offer, so we are not quite sure what the alternative might have been. Small parties, always made up of families with direct fealty to Kiith, were sent out occasionally to bring back texts that were in danger of destruction, usually because the cities that held them were being constantly sacked. Sometimes these parties would even spirit away scholars imprisoned for heresy. It wasn't until Ifrit Nabal Saw came to head the secretive Kiith that a less isolated philosophy began to take hold. Ifrit realized the wars were dangerously close to destroying the last of the infrastructure that kept the bulk of the Kharakid people alive. Fields were being burned, dams demolished, and the sand traps torn down simply to deprive the enemy of valuable resources. Under such an onslaught, the days of civilization on Kharak were numbered. Though declared pacifists, much of the knowledge discovered and hoarded by the Kiith Nabal had direct military application, and so when Ifrit Nabal Saw finally proposed intervention to his people, it took only a few years for a military force to be assembled. The Nabal had been keeping the secrets of explosives, steam, and refining for more than 100 years, and when they rose, they swept out of their hidden city of Tyr like the gleaming servants of Jakul himself. Steam-powered vehicles towed cannons to bring down the walls of despotic Kiithid, while handfuls of soldiers carrying repeater rifles and wearing hardened armor moved to rout marauding armies 20 times their size. Ifrit Nabal Saw spoke at every holding, village, and city his army liberated, and offered those people all the fruits of Nabal science and technology, if they would but lay down their arms and end the pointless destruction. Unlike the major powers in the Heresy Wars, Nabal Saw did not demand renunciation of former Kiith ties. All he asked for was an ending. The Lesser Kiithid, brutalized by nearly 300 years of war, gratefully accepted his terms, and soon the Nabal army had grown 50-fold, with Kiithid whose only desire was to end the Heresy Wars any way they could. And in 3 short years they had done it. Ifrit Nabal Saw's last act before stepping down as Saw was to establish the Diamid in Tyr as a place where all Kithid, powerful and weak, could gather to resolve disputes and set policy for all of Kharak. In the decades to follow, Nabal rebuilt the damaged infrastructure of Kharak and improved upon it with their no longer secret construction and metallurgical techniques. Any minor Kithid were accepted into Nabal if they simply wanted to learn new crafts and trades. These same Kithid were then allowed to go their own way if they chose, and many of the major industrial Kiith of the modern world began under Nabal's wing. By the time of reason, 200 years later, Kiith Nabal had replaced the perilous sand sail routes to the south with rail-mounted steam cars and had given Kiith Paktu Sa of the southern polar region a permanent presence in the Diamid. Kiith Nabal seemed content to slowly fade into history for many years, but recent stresses on Kharakid society, mainly the encroachment of the desert sands on many settlements in the north, and increased hostility from Kiith Galcian seemed to have steered Nabal back to the forefront of politics. Nabal has formed permanent alliances with both the Sajet and Soban Kithid, and has taken the lead in organizing both expeditions to the Draki anomaly. Financial analysts have noted heavy Nabal investment in aerospace research, with special interest in proposed facilities in low Kharak orbit and beyond. Regardless of the detailed plans of this very secretive Kiith, it should be clear to anyone on the political scene that Nabal has always had an eye to the future and a deep commitment to being on the cutting edge on the shaping of that future. Paktu. Prior to the year 462, Kiith Paktu was a minor farming Kiith living on the slopes above the Salt Sea. On the year their most famous leader, Majir Paktu, was born, the long rift between the religious leaders of Kiith Sidim and Kiith Galcian, which were then the most powerful Kiith of the north, finally became an unbridgeable divide. In 462 KDS, the famous Sidim Council announced a new dogma. The traditional Sidim cosmology, which once held that all Kithid on Kharak were exiled from a heavenly paradise, was abandoned. The truth, according to the proclamation of 462, was that only the Sidim were of divine origin. All other Kithid were native to Kharak and therefore inferior, their blood tainted by corrupting sand. In accordance with the new dogma, many cruel pogroms were passed against non-Sidim Kithid, the people known as Gritidim, or Sand People. By far the harshest of these measures was the Clean Water Act, which forbade non-Sidim Kithid from living at the headwaters of a river or stream, lest they foul the water which Sidim downstream would have to drink. Hundreds of families were displaced by Sidim temple men, turned out of their ancestral homes and made to march downstream, carrying as much of their former lives with them as they could. In 488 KDS, Kiith Paktu joined the ranks of the dispossessed. At the same time, the temples of the neighboring Kiith Galcian had become obsessed with sins of pride and by the redemption of Kharak through suffering. The Sidim made obvious targets for the sermons of Galcian holy men. For every Sidim sin of pride, they said a more brutal and excruciating expiation was demanded by the gods of Kharak. Lesser Kithid of the north, already suffering under the weight of Sidim oppression, often were willing to join their holdings to the Galcian rather than see them taken by the Sidim. Many welcomed Galcian soldiers and temple men into their holdfasts, only to find themselves held at sword point and made to watch as their sinful books and belongings were burned to appease the gods. Heavy tributes of both food and fodder were demanded by Galcian armies, and appalling sacrifices were sometimes demanded by Galcian priests, who saw no reason why the pure of heart should suffer alone. Clashes between the Sidim and Galcian holdings intensified over time, and even remote Kithid were forced to choose sides. Both great Kithid were too powerful for any smaller Kithid to challenge on its own. Caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place, the Gritidim were finally ready to try the unthinkable, crossing the great banded desert to the south, looking for new land. By this time, Majir Paktu had become the Paktu Kiith Sa. Although the first migration may not have been entirely his idea, it's certain that the fate of all the people of Kiith Paktu was in his hands. It is difficult for us to imagine today what he must have felt as his people built the first great sailors at the edge of the desert. Although many Kharaki believed there might be arable land at the southern pole, no one had ever attempted to cross the great banded desert and return to tell the tale. The only confirmation of a land south of the desert came from mad Manani travelers, rambling about endless seas and grasses that touched the sky. The migration offered slim hope at best, so slim that no Kharakian dared to risk it until there was no other hope at all. The rest, as they say, is history. Nearly 50 Kiithids set out from the plain of Albegido in 490 KDS and sailed into the Great Banded Desert, sweeping over the burning sands on the winds of the seasonal storm, the Chakmahat. By the time the men, women, and children of the first migration reached the shore of the Hunan Mountains, only 17 families were left, and all of them had lost weaker members on the journey. Still, more died as they struggled over the Hunan, without anyone to guide them to the easiest path. They lost many to poisonous water, rockfalls, thirst, and lizard bite. As the story goes, many of the firsters fell into despair among the burning red canyons of the Hunan and did not want to go on. Despite whether he had been the leader from the beginning of the migration, Majir Pakhtu was definitely the leader on that day. He stood at the head of the column and pleaded with the people to continue. "I can smell the sea," he said. "It's only a little further." The people did not believe him, and more than a few turned to start the hard trek back to their sand sailors still docked at the desert shore. But as legend has it, at that moment a bird appeared in the cloudless sky above them, a sea spirit, circling against the hot sun. The Kiithid of the first migration followed the sea spirit and Majir Pakhtu through the mountains, and when they stood on the last red hilltop, they were looking down at the rolling breakers of a great gray sea. Straight away, that expanse of water was named the Majirian Sea, after the man who brought them there. The people of the first migration settled on the shores of the Majirian and were presumed dead by many in the north for almost 2 years until it took to build up their homes and holdings. In the spring of the third year, however, Majir Pakhtu and a group of picked volunteers attempted another crossing of the Great Banded Desert to take back word of the new land to the north, where so many still lived in a nightmare of war and oppression. Majir Pakhtu did not survive their return, but 7 of his followers did. These 7 Pakhtu Kiithsmen passed through the Northlands on foot, taking word of the new land with them everywhere they went. Once that word spread, there was no stopping it. Dozens of families built sand sailors on the famous plain of Albegido every year, trying to escape the heresy wars and the madness of their Sidim and Gulsian masters. Alas, the Sidim and Gulsian were not quite finished with the people who escaped their tyranny. Although they ignored the migrations for many years, both Sidim and Gulsian lost many hectares of holdings to the war. By 650 KDS, it occurred to both of the great northern Kiithid that many of those who fled to the south were still considered their vassal clans, and by treaty still owed them lands and tribute. There were at least 3 major attempts to assault the southern lands from 652 to 700 KDS. The last of these was the most successful. The army of Liam Gulsian actually arrived at the pass of the Hunan Mountains almost intact in the spring of 698 KDS, ready to subdue the unruly Kiithid of the Southlands and their Kiith Sa. On that day, Kim Pakhtu, the grandson of Majir Pakhtu and Pakhtu Kiith Sa, arrayed an army of 30,000 swords on the shore of the Majirian. Every one of them wore the colors of Kiith Pakhtu, and every standard bearer carried its flag. "These are my people," Kim Pakhtu said, "and this land is ours. You have no vassals here." Badly outnumbered and facing a fresh and well-supplied army, Liam Gulsian nonetheless led his troops into battle. Very few of the Gulsian who followed him that day escaped with their lives. Although they killed hundreds of Pakhtu, the southern Kiith Sa eventually prevailed, and no such crusade was ever attempted again. To this day, the flag of the Pakhtu is white, the color of the sand sails which carried its people across the banded desert, emblazoned with a sun stained red by the blood of those who died in search of, or in defense of, freedom. Silhouetted against that sun is the shape of the sea spirit, an eternal symbol of hope and faith. Pakhtu believed fiercely in independence and despised priests and dictators. Its people are optimistic, innovative, and venturesome. When things are darkest, someone will almost always repeat the Kiith's motto, "I can smell the sea." Soban. In Kharakid society, the majority of citizens are secure in their faith ties. Within the immediate family and within the larger circle of more distant blood relationships, not to mention our professional associations and alliances, most of us are bound at many levels. If we should ever have a falling out with one Kiith Sa, we belong to many other Kiithid by marriage and inclination, and could change our alliances at any time. This was not always the case. Prior to the emergence of the Southern Federation and the Nabal intervention, very few Kharakians had ties outside their own Kiith, and if they did, they were ties of dominance and submission. One Kiith was made vassal to another and owed tribute to its masters, in return for which it was given the protection of the larger Kiith's army and the benefit of trade with the larger Kiith's holdings. In all of this, however, there was no provision made for those who were without Kiith. Unthinkable as this state may seem to us today, it can still bring a shudder to the modern Kharakian to consider the fate of a Kiithless man or woman during those times. Banishment from the Kiith was effectively a death sentence at any time prior to the year 416 KDS, when Kiith Soban was born. The origins of Kiith Soban, the Grey Brotherhood, are somewhat hazy. It appears that two vassal Kiithid which held lands along the Second Sea were invaded by the temple men of a strong neighboring Kiith. The vassals fought back furiously, defending their homes with desperate strength, and succeeded in killing a few of the raiding Kiith. In revenge, the invaders punished the survivors brutally, although they had already surrendered. Many of the basic taboos of Kharakian society were violated. All the children of the farmers were murdered, as well as the leader, man or woman, of every family. Those that remained were driven from their holdings and fled across the sparkling desert to carry the news of these atrocities to their Kiith Sa. The leader of this group was Soban, later known as Soban the Red. When he knelt before his Sa, he recounted the horrors that the neighboring Kiith had committed against his people and demanded vengeance. He offered to personally lead the army that would ravage the invaders and teach them the error of their ways, and waited for the men and women of his Kiith Sa to join him in a rush across the sparkling desert. Unfortunately, this support was never to come. Soban's Kiith Sa, afraid of the possible repercussion, or perhaps simply realizing the Kiith was not strong enough to prevail against a larger and stronger Kiith, refused to attack the Reavers. Instead, members of the smaller Kiith became vassals to the larger, joining their blood to the blood of the murderers. When he heard of this, Soban tore the colors of his Kiith from his body in shame. His followers did the same, and in doing so they abandoned their Kiith completely, an unheard of gesture at the time, especially coming as it did from landless men and women. According to legend, Soban then declared the word Kiith was meaningless when any Kiith Sa could turn a deaf ear to the blood of children crying from the ground. He vowed that he would never belong to any false Kiith again. The only Kiith which deserved the word was the Kiith of Spirit, the brotherhood of like mind and shared ambitions. All the followers of Soban took a new color, a deep and vivid red, the color of blood flowing from the heart. Although they could not have been many, their first act as a Kiith was a successful attack on the holdings which had once been their homes. When they left their old farms behind, not a blade of grass was left green, nor one stone standing on top of another. Everything was razed, and every invader killed in ways that gave Kiith Soban a bloody reputation for years to come. Kiith Soban became a martial Kiith from then on, and as years passed, a particular set of rituals developed among them. Although many other warrior Kiithid existed at the time, those Kiithid were standard in their aims and organization. They were martial to the extent that they desired the property and possessions of their weaker neighbors. Only the Soban were completely landless and existed purely as mercenaries. The Sobani mercenary is a curious feature of Kharakian history. For centuries, Sobani took part in every military conflict on the planet, and their skills as soldiers and commanders were highly prized. When the services of any given Soban were bought, he or she would dress in the colors of the new Kiith and fight in the service of that Kiith regardless of personal risk or cost. When the term of service was over, down to the hour and minute, Soban mercenaries would put down their arms, remove their adopted colors, and return to their Kiith. If the end came during the middle of a battle or 1,000 miles from home, they would still go. Contracts for their services could not be renewed on the scene, and only through their Kiith Sa. To this day, the Soban are completely devoid of standard family groupings. No marriage, as such, is permitted among their ranks. Although male and female Sobani are permitted to form whatever alliances they might want, there is no such thing as a Sobani child. Children born to the Soban are left as foundlings with other Kiiths, or their parents are made to leave Kiith Soban to raise them. The skills of Kiith Soban are still viable in today's troubled times, and they never lack for money and influence. Sobani are often preferred when influential Kiithid like the Nabal need intelligence officers or security officers, and virtually all modern-day officers are trained at Soban-run military academies based in Tyr. The entire Northern Coalition now has access to the training and discipline that was once available only to lifelong Sobani. A current of true Sobanism still exists in our society and always will, as long as some men and women continue to reject the status quo. Some Kharakis still join Kiith Soban of their free will, renouncing all other Kiith ties and associations. Others are forced to join when driven from other Kiiths for violating their taboos. Before taking the red, as it is called, a prospective Sobani must repeat the ritual which Soban performed centuries ago. All their Kiith colors must be forcibly ripped from the body, a powerful gesture of negation. To some, it represents the ultimate rebellion, to some the only salvation. But Kiith Saban imposes the same discipline and solidarity on them all, for which Kharakid society may well thank them. Manan. Perhaps the strangest of all Kharakid Kiithid is the Manan, or the Travelers. Although the blood bonds between the Manani are not strong, they range greatly in physical appearance and Kiith traditions. They are nevertheless all considered one family, especially by outsiders, who for centuries viewed these nomads as a dire threat to decency and morals, to unprotected holdings, and to the virtue of young men and women from good families. The antipathy toward Manani is simple enough to explain. During a time when the majority of Kharakians were hard-working farmers clinging to life with teeth and fingernails, the Manani maintained a traditional nomadic existence. They traveled from place to place, stopping at watering places to rest. If the water was surrounded by a hold, the Manani expected hospitality. Although they were rarely hostile toward farmers and city dwellers, they resisted any attempts to settle or civilize their Kiith. Driven by a hunger for new experiences and restlessness few other Kharakians could understand, the Manani could never stay in one place for long. They simply picked up stakes and moved on into the wastes again, leaving the security and the hard work of house and hold behind them. The earliest historical mention of Manani wanderers comes from the year 340 KDS, when holdings along the shore of the White Desert complained that their farms had been raided by the travelers. According to the report they sent to their Kiith, the White Desert holders had recently closed their gates to a wandering Kiith, refusing them permission to make camp by the waterside. Although the Manani went away peacefully at the time, they returned by night and came over the wall by the hundreds, overwhelming the resistance of the surprise holders. In the end, the Manani were accused of stealing nearly a ton of food and many hundred man-weights of water, which was, coincidentally, just a bit more than the tribute which was owed by their White Desert holders to the Kiith that year. The tale of the White Desert holders was dubious for many reasons. Although it was widely believed by landed Kharaki at the time and for many centuries to follow, the report that Manani came over the wall of a sand dike by the hundreds is absurd, given the fact that traditional Manani never traveled in groups larger than an extended family, and in such a group there would have been a dozen able-bodied men at most. To find Manani by the hundreds, one would have to seek them out at the Gathering, their yearly meeting on the sands of Faran Shah, the dancing ground. Not only was Faran Shah nearly 200 miles from the White Desert, but focus at such a gathering would be celebration and drinking, not killing and looting. Fighting of any kind was forbidden at Faran Shah. To profane sacred ground with spilled blood was the greatest Manani taboo. Is this to say there was no basis for Kiith Manan's early reputation as thieves? Unfortunately, no. If the majority of Manani were innocent of raiding, there were still some who undoubtedly traveled in greater strength and might have been capable of carrying off a few water barrels. The majority of travelers were probably guilty of a little judicious pilfering from time to time, even if it was only picking a pocket or picking fruit in the night. The real question was not whether the Manani were really thieves, but why. If they were widely believed to be thieves, would the majority of holdings open their gates to Manani visitors? An answer of one word will suffice: entertainment. The Manani were always traders, but prior to the Great Migration, they could never compete with the legitimate trade routes among the northern holdings, at least when it came to transporting mundane cargoes. In order to survive, a Kiith of travelers needed to bring their would-be hosts something that they could not get cheaper or more routinely somewhere else. In some cases, Manani would carry rare drugs or medicines that could be found only in remote places or traffic in taboo items, but since their caravans were often searched before being allowed to enter a holding, the Manani would more often carry a less tangible but even more valuable freight: music, laughter, and spectacle, a break from the hard and unending work of a desert farmer's life. For many years, Kiith Manan survived by their wits and their ability to amuse hold-born Kharaki. Singers and poets, magicians, dancers, actors, and conmen. There was nothing to the rumor that Manani could perform dark magic, but they could certainly make your purse and your 15-year-old daughter disappear. After the Great Migration began, life changed drastically for the Manani. Although they played no important role in the first crossing, a small Kiith of travelers accompanied the Paktu in the sand sailors that left Albegido in 490. Most of them returned to the north in 497 KDS, bringing their three-masted ships with them. The Manani took to the new technology in droves and made many improvements to the original design. During the beginning of the Heresy Wars, Manani still living in the north suffered badly under the rule of Sidim and Galsium. Their freewheeling and joyous attitude was anathema to both of the great Kiith. and one of the few points of doctrine that both parties could agree on was that Manani were abominations before the eyes of Seljuk. The last celebration at Faran Shah was held in 513 KDS, during which an army of Sidim attacked the dancing grounds and slaughtered the celebrants wholesale. After the massacre at Faran Shah, the majority of Kiith Manan survivors took to the sail and the sword. Manani raiders, once largely a myth, became a grim and terrible reality to Sidim holdings that bordered on the desert. No one was safe from the pirate sailors, and the sight of a mast on the horizon was an occasion of panic and terror. Within 100 years, however, the Manani exhausted their appetite for bloodshed and began to use their ships for more profitable ventures. When the great mother of their Kiith saw, Jorah Manan, declared the war on the Sidim at an end in 656 KDS, the Manani built a new dancing ground in the Paktu held south and turned their fleet completely to trade. The questing spirit of the Manani is not dead even today. Kiith Manan still controls enormous wealth, and of all the Kharakid Kiithid, it is the most likely to produce a diplomat or a statesman. Manani are also common in the ranks of scout pilots and are always eager to volunteer when it's time to fly an experimental craft. Being the first to see anything new and different is a hunger that still burns deep in their blood. Sidim, no future without tradition. Though Kiith Sidim has always been a major voice in deciding the direction of all Kharakians, it has always pulled back from the brink when the path to complete domination meant risking the destruction of the entire Kiith. During the Heresy Wars, the Sidim were the largest proponent of the Fall from Grace faction, those that believed our people had been exiled due to some act of hubris that offended the gods. Their greatest enemy, Kiith Galcian, believed that very idea was an affront. To believe our people capable of vexing the gods was arrogance beyond belief, and the essence of heresy. To modern minds, the Galcian and the Sidim engaged in decades of madness to decide not if we were a cursed people, but how the curse was being carried out. The war continued, with many lives and resources being savagely squandered, until finally Kiith Nabal emerged from Tyr. Nabal offered reason in the face of dogma and resistance in the face of tyranny, and Kharak responded with a resounding roar of assent. The religious Kiithid reacted to this massive shift in the power structure in vastly different ways. Samta, exhausted from poor trade and finances, returned to the earth, following the call to strengthen Kharak from its roots. Galcian retreated deeper into its dogma, went mad and destroyed our greatest city, and then retreated into the desert rather than give up on a war that only they could rationalize. And finally, Kiith Sidim seems to have found a third way. When their own mad dream of being the chosen of God began to shatter, they rejoined society as quietly and progressively as possible given the circumstances. They made the right renunciations and quietly paid the right reparations, and by the early 800s, the Sidim were once again a major player in Kiithid politics and the new Diamid. Over the past 3 centuries, Kiith Sidim has presented a viewpoint of adapting to new challenges by looking to the past for lessons instead of dogma. For instance, while the Sidim Sa has often opposed loosening the laws that keep a family branch bound to their Kiith, the tactic they have followed is to make the new law as conservative as possible, while still satisfying the economic need for sideways mobility in Kharakian society. Sidim Sa has almost always been a cornerstone of the military arm of the coalition and has never skimped on its contributions both in personnel and material for various campaigns against Galcian raiders over the past few decades. They have been instrumental in the development of state-of-the-art crawler forces for their military arm as well. A few sour notes still sound in an otherwise harmonious accord. Kiith Sidim have been charged in front of the Diamond recently with claims that Sidim military units have been guilty of excessive force during operations against their old enemy from the Heresy Wars. Sidim Sa answers these charges by stating the most well-documented instances are isolated cases of war stress. They are unfortunate and regrettable, but do not represent any kind of official policy. Stories like this show that despite the energy that Sidim have invested in becoming part of Kharak's future, their past still clings to them. While the other major Kiithid have not pressed any formal complaints against the Sidim, they have done little to defend their allies against these rumors. It is still said that the fanatical Dwayne Kiith that rose to prominence during the Mission Suleiman riots in 1024 KDS were being secretly funded by an arm of Sidim Intel. All powerful Kiith have one rumor or another leveled against them at any given moment, from Nabal corporate control schemes to theories that Kiith Sajet actually plans to flee Kharak in some sort of super rocket. The current edge of unease towards Sidim can be seen as nothing more than a sign that despite growing problems, Kiith is an acknowledged force in modern diamond politics. The respect and cooperation extended toward the Sidim is a fitting tribute for a Kiith that stood at the brink of destruction before accepting the future and finding a place in it for themselves. It is a lesson that all Kharak can only pray the Gulsian Saw will learn from, before more lives and resources are lost. Brawl. To explore the history of the Kiith of Kharak is to enter a world of deepest tradition, where the actions that drive the world today have their origin in events going back centuries. Of course, no matter how much a society cherishes tradition, there will always be those who reject the past in favor of a new paradigm that fits the situation around them. Kiith would be the best example of this attitude. Their philosophy places them at the boundary between innovation and blasphemy. Horal was born out of the chaos at the end of the Heresy Wars. Crushed between Gulsian aggression and Sidim pogroms, dozens of Kiith were shattered and left with no choice but to seek shelter with the aggressors. Even when Nabal emerged as the force for stabilization, the rules of Kiith-based society made the choice a difficult one. Changing Kiith alliances was a virtual surrender to another's destiny, to that of a much more powerful group of total strangers. No choice at all until 5 Saw of shattered Kiith met in a small tent outside the fortress of Tyr and decided that tradition and all its rules had failed them completely. They decided that they owed nothing to the old system and there would be no bending of the knee. The remnants of 5 families would unify under a new name and elect a new Saw from amongst themselves. They would be beholden to the will of no other Kiith. When the sun came up and the doors of the new diamond were open, a new Kiith entered and a new Saw took her place among them, seating herself as an equal among equals. And no one knew quite what to do. At first, the guards and priests presumed they were looking at the Saw of some vassal Kiith, presenting herself to bring some issue or another to their attention, perhaps from a group so provincial that the woman and her entourage did not know where to stand or sit. But when the quiet, composed woman brought her own seat to the great ark and announced herself as the new Horal Saw, the diamond exploded into an uproar. The Sobani guards first responded to the roars of outrage and moved to remove the interlopers, but a single look from her own Saw stilled them in their tracks. Despite the bellows of Nabal and Sidim, whose Saw were so rarely in agreement, the calm, reasoned, and oft-amused comments from Paktu, Samta and Soban carried the day. Kiith Horal survived and was recognized formally as a legitimate Kiith. Despite the wave of popular support that swept through Kharakian society at this moment, when the existence of Horal made it feel like something has truly changed for all Kiith, great or small, the following years were not easy for the fledgling Kiith. In addition to constant legal challenges to their existence, mostly arranged by Sidim, Horal was finding it difficult to establish its niche in society. Whereas almost all other Kiith, no matter how small, had centuries-long reputations for one specialty or another, Horal was formed by necessity, not a shared tradition of skill. It hosted artisans, engineers, physical scientists, and economists, but not enough to sell its services as a unified group. It began to look as if Sidim would get its way and Horal would fail, disbanded not by law or by force, but by simple economics. Horal was going broke. One day, the forlorn Stel Horal Saw was touring the Nabal Ironworks when Sajet technicians supervised a group of surly Nabal artisans as they crafted one of the new Nabal steam cars. As she watched the team struggling to convey their different views and argue over the best way to proceed, she was struck by an inspiration that would change the face of modern Kharak forever. Seeing the workers of 2 different Kiiths with such different cultures struggle to cooperate and communicate, she realized that while Horal could never hope to exceed the knowledge base of the Sajet or the mechanical skill of Nabal, they did have one thing that other Kiith could not match: an urgent motivation to work together. With that, the Horal Saw returned to her meager Kiith holdings and convinced her Kiith that she had glimpsed the future, and all it would take was every ounce of wealth the Kiith had in order to purchase the rights to make the Nabal steam car under license. By the end of the next triad, the Saws of Nabal and Sajet were invited to watch 40 Horal workers spend a day putting together 3 steam cars that would have taken the other Kiith a month to make. Horal had used its unique blend of disciplines to separate the complex mission of creating an incredibly sophisticated machine into an orderly system of relatively simple tasks. Within the year, Horal had created a revolution in industry that is still being felt today. In an empty workshed, they had created the first assembly line. From that one humble work shed, Haral has since expanded to build Kharak's largest manufacturing yards and encompass thousands of workers who cooperate to build everything from sand crawlers to our largest command carriers. While new conglomerate Kiith are still uncommon, splintering does happen often enough that leaders of larger Kiithid have become far more sensitive to the needs of smaller member families. And while Haral will never be the closest of allies of the Sidim, the two Kiithid have worked together closely. The newest Sidim command carrier was built in Haral's main manufacturing yards outside of Tyr. Change is its own curse. Ironically, Haral is managing the fallout of internal dissent that may yet still shake the Kiith to its core. Despite its foundation in adaptability, many engineers and scientists of Haral broke away to form Kiith Lirha in 1012 KDS, which shifted their combined holdings from manufacturing assets in terrestrial hardware to aerospace fabrication and orbital deployment. Their argument is that Lirha will soon be in a position to dominate the next frontier of Kharakian engineering and technology. With desert expedition hardware currently being so lucrative, the current Haral Saw, Jadones, and much of his inner council do not believe it is yet time to risk everything on expensive technology that may never bear any tangible valuable assets. Time will tell whether Haral will adapt to the ever-shifting industrial landscape, or whether it's time for this new group of families to forge their own future. Samta. Of the earliest days of Kiith Samta, little is known, although this ancient family can trace its unbroken lineage back over 1,000 years on Kharak. The Samta made their ancestral homes in the peaks and valleys of the Kontala mountain range, one of the more dramatic geographic features in Kharak's northern hemisphere. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, Samta holdings in the Kontala were rich and varied, running the gamut from farms, dams, and mills to fortresses and towns, including the walled cities of Hameln and Gaideo. The Kiith was more than self-sufficient. The terraced farms of the lowlands and the seasonal grazing pastures of the highlands produced a great surplus of food and hides, and the Samta prospered in trade. Starting in the year 178 KDS, Kharakian artists from various disciplines were gathered under the patronage of Tagore Samta, one of the most enlightened Kiithid of his time. Employing hundreds of skilled masons, painters, architects, and weavers, Kiith Samta began building a series of temples on the slopes of the mountain called Lungmajin, the roof of the world. There were 33 temples in all, leading from the sands of the Kasar to the very summit of what was at the time the world's highest known mountain. Collectively, the 33 temples of the Samta were known as the Shimmering Path. For nearly 400 years, it was considered the height of spiritual devotion for a religiously inclined Kharakian to walk the Shimmering Path. Most Kharakians attempted the trip at least once a lifetime. Beginning at the first temple, the Oracle of Talah, the distance that a pilgrim was able to travel on his or her own feet was considered a watermark for the strength of the faith that burned within. The vast majority of Kharakians finished the pilgrimage at the 7th temple, the famous Dome of Heaven, which lay within the city walls of Gaideo. For those stubborn few who felt the need to move closer to God, however, there were 26 more temples along the Shimmering Path, each more inaccessible than the last. The highest of these was the Temple of Mysteries, which very few travelers could reach. The upper slopes of Lungmajin were a blasted ladder of crumbling granite and thin ice, and constantly buffeted by freezing gale-force winds. According to legend, the most sacred relics of the Samta were kept on the altar of this temple, and any pilgrim who made the journey on foot was permitted to touch them. The famed Star Metal Scrolls, which were alleged to have been written by the hand of Jakul himself in a language which no living man could read. Since the later days of the Heresy Wars, Kiith Samta had largely abandoned the role as a religious Kiith by about 1000 KDS. The vast majority of Samta's Kiithid were engaged in another profession, the profession by which they are still best known today: mining. The transformation of Kiith Samta from a primary religious Kiith to a hardworking miner's Kiith was a slow and painful one, and involved many generations of privation and suffering. The centuries of the Heresy Wars were hard times for the Samta. Their Kontala Mountains provided a natural barrier between the forces of Galcian and Sidim, and both sides struggled urgently to subdue or seduce the Samta for nearly 200 years. The flow of pilgrims to Samta temples slowed disastrously in a world at war, and soon there was not enough money flowing into the Kiith's coffers to maintain those temples in their intended role, as way stations along the Shimmering Path. Eventually, in the year 675 KDS, all 33 of the Samta temples were closed to outsiders except for the Oracle of Tala and the Dome of Heaven. By virtue of their sheer stubbornness and the natural protection provided by the narrow passages and forbidding peaks of their homeland, the Samta were able to hold off all invaders during the worst of the Sidim and Galcian conflict. More difficult to resist, however, was the seduction of becoming a vassal clan, especially when the Samta holdings, although easy to defend, were also easy to cut off from trade routes. Even a small garrison could hold the Khazar like a cork in a bottle, and keep the Samta trapped in their mountain fortresses. Invaders couldn't enter, but neither could caravans or other visitors. Contact with the outside was sporadic throughout the 7th and 8th centuries. The Samta held no goods sufficiently inviting to keep the Khazar road open. This changed in the year 789 KDS, when Kura Samta, then Kiith Sa of the 30,000 souls who still made their homes in the Kontala, awoke one night from a strange dream. Kura had seen the image of the god Sejuk, driving a great red sword into the earth in the Kontala Mountains, in a seldom visited region far from the main roads. Driven by the urgency of her vision, she ordered several smaller families to begin digging in the Red Creek Valley. Because their Kiith Sa was descended from the temple woman of Tala, the Samta reluctantly obeyed, and several Samta Kiithid moved to the area and began the excavation, although no one was quite certain what they were looking for. What the Samta found at Red Creek was a deposit of the richest iron ore ever seen on Kharak, which lay just 6 feet below the soft sediments of the valley floor. Here was enough metal to be hammered into 100,000 swords, and Kiith Samta was not slow to announce their find to the rest of the world, although both Sidim and Galcian offered ruinous sums to buy the mine, or the ore that it produced. Kura Samta refused to trade with either side. In her own words, "Why should I sell these madmen a knife to cut my throat with?" Instead, the Samta built their own smelters and began mixing the iron with carbon, producing a very high-grade steel, a commodity far more precious than gold, especially during those dangerous times. An arrangement that eventually sustained Kura Samta's Kiith was made with the Sobani, who immediately saw the use for Samta steel and the superior weapons that could be forged from it. In exchange for a yearly tribute from the smelters at Homeworld, the Soban signed an unheard-of contract. The mercenary Kiith agreed to keep the Khazar open and clear of marauders for a period of no less than 100 years. With the Nabal intervention, the Samta expanded their operations, throwing themselves into their new profession with the Kiith's customary enthusiasm. Although they haven't developed any significant technological advances on their own, they are always quick to buy, copy, or outright steal any new tool or technique, once another Kiith has put it into operation. Thus, the Samta profited greatly from the introduction of steam-powered drills, narrow-gauge railroads, and chemical explosives. Kiith Samta is now nearly 500,000 strong and have even built new holdings alongside great industrial Kiithid like Nabal and Haral. Knef. When we talk of the costs of war on Kharak, the usual topics are the loss of farmlands to shattered sand walls, the destruction of Sajuk Ka, or the resulting banishment of Kiith Galcian, their collected wisdom and art gone forever. But there is a price that very, very few scholars are comfortable talking about: the loss of entire people to the wastes, not only in body but in mind. Some families did not just abandon fields and farms, but left behind all faith in civilization and rule of law. They lost their souls to the sand. During the darkest days of the Sidim dogma, when entire small Kiithid were declared Gritadim and forced from their holdings, many family groups simply picked up whatever supplies they could and fled. While some survived long enough to be absorbed by the Galcian during the Heresy Wars, many died or simply disappeared in the deep desert. As the wars ended and the Age of Reason brought stability and growth to a ravaged world, the disappearances continued. Some were attributed to bandits, others simply to acts of madness. After the Galcian exile, a de facto explanation slipped into place. Any small settlement abandoned or destroyed was attributed to the acts of religious fanaticism. For centuries, this explanation served to placate the fearful and bereaved. No one liked to think that a family could be seduced by Galcian prophets and join the exiles, but it was a familiar pain and loss that we could understand, discuss, and eventually accept. Unfortunately, the truth is sometimes darker than we imagine. Over the last 100 years of increasing aggression from the Galcian, our intel units have come to know the enemy much better. They have captured many prisoners, intercepted communiques, and even exchanged information freely with the raiders when situations arose that threatened all the peoples of Kharak. Through that long, painful line of communication runs a single thread that many tried to deny until the proof was unavoidable. In 1024, a cryptographer named Masar Manan brought a carefully prepared report to his superiors based on single word recognition in broken Gaussian codes. One word in particular stood out, as it was often related to small action casualty reports and small community raids. Masar's superiors brushed off his report initially, thinking it had merely stumbled across another Gaussian term for the coalition. When he pressed the matter, it was even suggested that he had been unduly influenced by his Manani heritage, and the old travelers' tales of monsters that rode with the storm. But the young officer had been classically trained as a linguist before joining the coalition intelligence arm, and stubbornly argued his data. He could demonstrate that in 500 confirmed coalition Gaussian events, the term Fagan was used in all 500 references, but in another 150 reports that had no correlation to known coalition action reports, the term Kiith was used. Masar thought it was clear that there was another hostile force operating out in the wastes. Fortunately, for settlements on the fringes of our civilization, he fought to make himself heard. Early in 1026, Masar was put in charge of an intelligence task force dedicated to the question, was there a new force operating alongside or against the Gaussian raiders? What he eventually found was truly disturbing. The first discovery was that Fagan and Kiith were not synonyms from different Gaussian dialects. The two words meant completely different things in all Gaussian dialects. Fagan was the standard term for the coalition, the bound and the blind. Translated loosely, Fagani are blind followers of a false god. The Fagan is the extended rope which runs from one family member to another in a howling sandstorm and allows them to continue following their leader and cling to one another even when they cannot see or hear for themselves. The Gaussian consider coalition Kiithid to be deluded and misled, dangerously slow, but they still classify us as believers. They see science and logic as just another set of deities, and in their minds, we are an enemy that can be redeemed if we could simply grasp the rope which is attached to a better leader and follow the true path to redemption. The Kiith are something else altogether. Derived from a very ancient word, Kiith literally means godless, a thing that the Gaussian mind can barely comprehend. To be Kiith is to believe in nothing. No god, no law, no justice, no Kiith. Kiith is a person with a soul of a beast. If the ties that bind us to our shared humanity are a rope, the Kiith has willingly drawn a knife and cut the cord. The Gaussian believe that the Kiith roam the wastes where even the boldest raiders would fear to go. When word spread that the coalition was ready to acknowledge the possibility that Kiith existed, the Gaussian Sa allowed certain records to be shared discreetly with Masar's task force. Over a period of 3 years of painstaking research and cross-references, Masar was able to piece together a picture from the darkest fringes of Kharakian history. Not all of the Gritatim had been assimilated or destroyed. Many struck out on their own, and many died, but some didn't. They survived, first by looting the ruins left after battles, and later, when things began to stabilize, by preying on each other. To be Kiith was to have no goal except for survival, no belief past the need to remain alive, and no loyalty but to oneself. Kiith would spare one another only to the degree that a rival group was stronger than the other available targets. The Kiith lived on in the empty spaces where the major powers could not, for hundreds of years after the Heresy Wars. While we reveled in our new world of reason, they massacred small settlements and ambushed unwary caravans. They took everything. Every scrap of cloth and metal could be used to keep some other machine working. Every child could be brought up as a warrior. Every corpse was food and raw materials. We have been breeding monsters at the edge of our society for hundreds of years without even noticing them. Only the Gaussian took note, because the Kiith preyed on them more often and more openly than any other Kiith. As we stand on the edge of more chaotic times, with war threatening every civilized holding and deserts rising to flow over every barrier, the Kiith have only increased in strength. Raider fleets composed of fast-moving vehicles have been photographed by recon aircraft racing along the edge of storms. There can be no doubt that in the coming years, the coalition military will have to engage the Kiith and deal with whatever non-standard tactics they have mastered. Where Kiith Gaussian will throw its power in such a conflict remains to be seen. There have been dozens of other situation papers written about the Kiith in the years since Masar Manan first raised the alarm, but none of them have yet to surpass the tone of this concluding paragraph. Without a doubt, every person reading this analysis can remember unruly nights as a child when your family Sa would place your back in bed, perhaps a bit firmly, and explain to you in a hushed voice that troublesome children would be left out on the wall for the Gaussian to steal away in the night. Now stop for a moment and think about the monsters the Gaussian have been using to frighten their children since the fall of Saju Ka. Think hard on that. If there is one thing I have learned, it is this: we are not the only ones they fear. Alright, so that was the very long-winded, updated history of the Kharakid social systems, the Kiith histories, and so on. Hopefully that was enjoyable, and we'll continue on in the next video.